Hello. Today I'd like to talk about physician-assisted suicide, as it is highly debatable in the United States especially, and it has been for a long time. There are currently only 2 states that allow it, and that is Washington and Oregon. My reason for choosing this topic is because I find it very interesting, and last semester I took biomedical ethics and we had to learn about it, and through learning more about it I developed my own opinion and realized that many people don't share the same opinion that I do. Why I feel I'm qualified to talk about this topic is because of the fact that I took biomedical ethics and I learned a lot about it through reading in the book and also through doing research because I had to do a paper about it. And I find it very interesting, and so I've looked up a lot of different topics about it. The topic can be relevant to anyone because it deals with a patient's choice. And any one of us could at any point become a patient in a hospital, or we might even be dealing with having a family member who is a patient in the hospital at the moment. Most people know what physician-assisted suicide is, but if you don't, let me tell you what it is. It's when a doctor prescribes a lethal dose of medication to a patient and that patient takes it and is allowed to die. Physician-assisted suicide can also be referred to as active euthanasia because the doctor is actively giving the barbiturate to the patient. In passive euthanasia, the patient just is allowed to die. And many people see a huge difference between being allowed to die and the right to die. Today I'd like to discuss what my belief is, why I see that there are people who are against it, and I'd also like to talk about the 2 states that allow it and how they have allowed it into their states. First off, my belief is that every person has the right to die. And I don't mean that everyone who goes into the hospital who has a minor fraction of a pain is allowed to make that decision that they just decided they want to die. I'm talking about terminally ill patients or patients who have a hard time with pain management or who can hardly find any type of treatment that's going to help them. I feel that it should be a patient's choice, and therefore it should be allowed in every single state in the United States. When a patient is going through their last leg of life and they make the decision that they don't want to deal with the pain anymore, then they should have the right to make that decision and be able to move on with their life. I found a nice quote, and it says, "Quality of life judgments are private and personal. Thus, only the sufferer can make relevant decisions." And this comes from Liberty and Death on the first page. It's a website. And I believe wholeheartedly in that quote because only the sufferer knows whether or not they are ready to die. It shouldn't be up to the rest of the world because someone who lives in Kansas has no idea what I'm going through at that moment if I was in the hospital. And so it shouldn't be the whole community's choice on whether or not I have the right to die. With the right to die, though, I think that there need to be regulations. Regulating fact of whether or not the patient is psychologically all there and ready to make that decision. It needs to be highly discussed between family members and the doctor. All pain management needs to be discussed. Different treatment options that may or may not be available need to be discussed. And it's something that a patient really needs to take the time to think about. Here's another quote dealing with patient autonomy. Patient autonomy. A patient should have the right to control the circumstances of his or her own death and to determine how much suffering is too much. And every patient has that edge of where they hit the point where they just can't deal with pain anymore. When women are in labor, they're able to get a dose of medication to help relieve the pain. And I'm not trying to relate labor to euthanasia, but it has some similarities with the pain medication. I can definitely see why a lot of people have issues with it and are against it, because in society, many people think that suicide is just wrong and that it shouldn't be someone's choice to just die just because they are ill. And I agree that it shouldn't be their choice just because they're ill. But what if they're terminally ill? Or what if they're, about ready to die? They can't find pain management. Most states don't allow it because a lot of people think that what they can consider it is murder, because the doctor is actively involved in the patient's death. But I don't think that you should look at it as murder, because the doctor is only following the patient's request, which is something that all doctors should have to do, and they do have to do. They just usually don't allow them to have a say in a patient's death. Like in this quote, where they talk about wrongness of killing. Wrongness of killing. Purposely helping a patient die is categorically wrong under any circumstances. Excellent palliative care does not include physician-assisted suicide. And that's the way a lot of people think. They think that because society views it as wrong, it's wrong, and so nobody should be allowed to make that decision. Now I want to talk about the two different states that allow it, Washington and Oregon. They have only been allowing it for the past maybe 20 years, so it's relatively new, and it's something that I think is making its way of having a lot more people agree with it. What Oregon says is, on October 27, 1997, Oregon enacted the Death with Dignity Act, which allows terminally ill Oregonians to end their lives through the voluntary self-administration of lethal medications expressly prescribed by a physician for that purpose. And that comes from the Death with Dignity Act on the first page. And I believe that that is a great choice, because it allows the patient to make that decision and not just society. In Washington, they allowed it, and what they say is that it's legal for doctors to prescribe a lethal dose of medication for patients with less than 6 months to live. So they give a certain amount of time for their patients, which Oregon might as well. But also with the Washington website, I found that it says patients must make 2 separate requests, orally and in writing, more than 2 weeks apart, must be of sound mind and not suffering from depression, and must have their request approved by 2 separate doctors. And this comes from Washington Passes Initiative 1000 on the first page. So they have a lot of regulations, and I believe that that's something that every state should have if they allow it, is regulations on who is allowed and how it's allowed to be administered and everything. Well, I hope that I gave you a couple of different things to think about when it comes to physician-assisted suicide, because I believe that it's everyone's right to die at the end of their lives when they're dealing with pain. But I also see that a lot of people just don't feel the same way, and they get concerned when talking about it. I think that every state should follow in Oregon and Washington's paths and decide to allow the person, the patient, to make that decision in their lives. So what do you think? Do you think everyone has the right to die?